The emergency pressure lock hissed, not with the sterile rush of recycled air, but with the acrid smell of burnt insulation and something sickeningly organic, like spoiled meat left too long near a plasma vent. Tyler Kane slammed his palm against the manual override, the impact jarring his worn skeletal structure. The metal casing was hot beneath his thin, synthetic uniform, vibrating with a resonant frequency that settled deep in his teeth. He inhaled sharply. The air was thick with the metallic tang of ozone and the stale, pervasive scent of industrial grease that clung to Nomara Station like a second skin. Val, external breach on deck 4. Hull integrity at 60%. That is not debris impact. That is directed penetration. Tyler did not shout. His voice was a low, gravelly monotone perfected over decades of speaking only when absolutely necessary. He shoved himself out of the maintenance cradle, his knees protesting with dull, grinding aches. The console immediately flashed amber alerts. Val's voice cut through the immediate sensory assault, synthesized calm barely masking the sudden surge of data processing. Affirmative, Tyler. The penetration signature matches the localized energy discharge of a Valzoon scout probe. Their infiltration tactics preceded the main fleet engagement by 12 hours, consistent with pre-landing surveillance insertion. They are inside the primary ventilation shafts. The Valzoon, not the Krill. The Valzoon were the surgical instruments, the shadows sent ahead to map weaknesses. Tyler had spent the last 5 years mapping every failure point of this decaying orbital coffin precisely so this day wouldn't matter. The irony tasted like ash. Did they find the primary data core? Tyler asked, already moving toward the nearest conduit access panel. The hallway lighting flickered erratically, casting long, distorted shadows that danced with the station's shuddering. He could feel the station's ancient structure groaning under the strain, the sound of metal yielding inch by agonizing inch to the vacuum outside. Negative. Access to the core requires biometric authentication of 3 specific Senate signatories, none of whom are currently assigned to this post. However, the Valzoon are systematically neutralizing every power conduit feeding life support to Sector Gamma. Projected total atmospheric failure in Sector Gamma, 37 minutes. Sector Gamma. That was where the civilian transport hub was located. Irrelevant. Scattered settlements below Synthera were not the target. The Valzoon wanted the Transport Authority records, the routes, the manifests, the proof of unauthorized resupply missions that kept the fragile human colonies alive despite the Senate's crippling regulations. It was never about conquest. It was always about control, about suffocating the periphery until it choked. Tyler wrenched the access panel open, the exposed wiring spitting tiny blue sparks. He smelled plastic melting under intense localized heat. This wasn't a military incursion, it was sabotage dressed in military livery. He was a maintenance supervisor, not a Marine, but the Senate had long ago ensured that the only personnel left on the fringe stations were those too broken, too overlooked, or too guilty to matter elsewhere. Tyler qualified for all 3. His previous assignment, the orbital disaster at Cygnus 5, was a fresh, phantom burn on his memory, a constant reminder of what happened when he trusted systemic logic over brute reality. He pulled a heavy magnetic spanner from his belt. Val, reroute power from non-essential environmental controls to the magnetic dampeners on decks 2 and 3. Flood the Valzoon primary access tunnels with an electromagnetic pulse burst on cycle 42. Slow them down. Tyler, that will drop localized gravity stabilization to 30%. You will lose footing. Furthermore, the pulse will require a manual shunt bypass at the primary relay junction, a location currently experiencing 0-point temperature flux due to internal coolant rupture. I know where the rupture is, Val. I wrote the repair log for that rupture 6 months ago. The Senate declared the repair economically unjustifiable last fiscal cycle. They prioritized a commemorative statue for a senator 3 sectors away. Tyler spat the words out, tasting the lingering bitterness of systemic neglect. He was being forced to fix a problem the centralized power structure had deemed too minor to warrant resources, while the enemy exploited that very omission. He moved into the crawl space, pulling himself along the narrow catwalk. The silence here was different from the vast silence of space. This was the tight, suffocating quiet of failing machinery. His breath hitched, a sharp, shallow intake, as the localized cold hit him. It wasn't just cold, it was the absence of thermal energy, painful against his exposed skin. The smell of old, mineral-laden ice mixed with the sharp scent of his own sweat, rapidly cooling into clammy vapor. He reached the junction box. It was encased in a thick layer of hoarfrost, the metal beneath turning brittle. Tyler could see the faint, shimmering distortion where the probe was cutting through the adjacent bulkhead, likely searching for the secondary comms array. He had seconds before they found the unsecured lines and broadcast their tactical findings directly to the incoming Krill fleet. Tyler ignored the pain shooting up his arm as he placed the spanner across the two main conduits. He had to bridge them manually, an act that would dump residual energy directly into his nervous system for a full second. Val, stand by for manual shunt. When I make contact, initiate the magnetic dampener sequence immediately, regardless of localized gravity feedback. Tyler, the energy discharge will induce severe neural trauma. Probability of maintaining consciousness post-shunt, 21%. 21% is better than 0% for Sector Gamma, Tyler ground out. He didn't hesitate. He had seen too many lives extinguished by bureaucratic inertia. He would trade his stability for a chance to slow down the absolute organized horror marching toward them. He jammed the spanner across the terminals. The world dissolved into blinding white noise and absolute physical paralysis. The pain was not external. It was a fire starting deep within his spinal column, seizing every muscle, every nerve ending. He saw the schematic for the Cygnus 5 core meltdown flash behind his eyes, the consequence of trusting the wrong schematics, the wrong people. Never again. Then the abrupt cessation. The paralysis snapped, leaving him dangling, gasping for the stale air. The smell of ozone was overpowering, almost suffocating. He tasted copper, not blood, but the phantom taste of massive electrical discharge. Shunt complete, Val reported, the voice steady again. Magnetic dampeners engaged. The Valzoon probe movement has ceased. It is currently pinned against the bulkheads by the localized field distortion. Tactical delay achieved, approximately 12 minutes. Tyler sagged, resting his forehead against the frigid metal. 12 minutes. 12 minutes to survive the immediate physical threat. 12 minutes to prepare for the overwhelming assault of the Krill armada that would arrive in under 4 hours. The injustice of it was crushing. He wasn't being saved by heroes. He was buying time with his own physical degradation against an enemy whose only true weakness he had already exploited. Val, Tyler whispered, his throat raw. They won't send scouts next time. They will send overwhelming force, bypassing the data core entirely. They know we are compromised. Get me the long-range broadcast array schematics. I need access to the trisector zoning frequency again. Tyler, that frequency is not intended for tactical messaging. Utilizing it against a military fleet is a Class Alpha violation of interstellar communication law. The resulting Senate review will be the least of your concerns. Tyler pushed himself back toward the main corridor, ignoring the tremor running through his left hand. The Senate already condemned Sector Gamma with their apathy, Vial. I'm dealing with immediate threats. Upload the administrative packet you flagged yesterday, the one concerning the unauthorized repair materials requisitioned from the defunct mining colony. I don't need to threaten them with war. I need to threaten them with an audit so complex, so suffocating, that their entire rigid structure seizes up. Ready the broadcast sequence. We are going to talk to the Krill leadership about their overdue hazardous waste disposal manifests. The tremor in his left hand was a violent, persistent jitter, a physical memory of the energy spike that still pulsed through his core systems. He pulled himself from the conduit, the stale air of the main engineering corridor smelling distinctly of moldering coolant and desperation. The station's internal lights, no longer receiving consistent power regulation, had settled into a nauseating, sickly yellow pulse, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stagnant atmosphere. Val, confirm Valzoon probe neutralization, Tyler managed, his voice raspy, as if chewing on fine gravel. The probe is thermally inert and immobilized. However, The localized EMP surge triggered cascading failures in 3 secondary environmental regulators in Sector Delta. Atmospheric pressure is normalizing, but the air quality is degrading rapidly due to off-gassing from damaged insulation polymers. You have approximately 90 minutes before the air becomes toxic even for short-term exposure. 90 minutes. The krill would arrive in under 4 hours, perhaps less, given the Valzoon probe's likely final transmission burst before shutdown. Tyler had bought time, but he had paid for it with the structural integrity of the station itself. He was trading a controlled external threat for an uncontrolled internal rot. He limped toward the central command hub, ignoring the throb where the electrical feedback had burned against his nervous system. His mind, however, was alarmingly clear. The Cygnus 5 disaster had taught him that systems always protect themselves before they protect the operators. The Senate's prioritization matrix was always skewed toward protecting centralized assets, regardless of the human cost on the periphery. He reached the command chair, the heavy synth leather cracked and cold beneath his weight. He stared at the long-range broadcast console, the archaic primary array looking like a relic from a bygone era of actual, human-piloted vessels. Begin compiling the legal packet VAL. Cross-reference every administrative violation recorded against the krill military machine in the last 400 standard cycles. Prioritize anything related to resource allocation oversight or compliance with neutral zone demarcation. Understood. Compilation is underway. However, Tyler, the Central Command Authority has initiated Protocol Echo 7 on this sector. A vessel is being dispatched for immediate extraction and administrative debriefing. Tyler froze, his fingers hovering inches from the control panel. Protocol Echo 7. It wasn't a rescue, it was an internal investigation. The Senate didn't send help until the crisis was contained, then they sent auditors to determine who was responsible for the breach of protocol that allowed the crisis. Identify the responding unit, Tyler commanded, the tremor in his hand momentarily replaced by a cold, hard certainty. The vessel is the Judicator's Will, a heavy frigate commanded by Chief Regulator Keaton Moreland. ETA, 38 minutes. His objective is stated as securing strategic assets and assessing maintenance liability. He will classify all unauthorized long-range transmissions as acts of military insubordination. Keaton Moreland. Tyler remembered the name from the Cygnus 5 inquiry. A precise, emotionless automaton who had spent 3 subjective weeks meticulously dissecting Tyler's maintenance logs to prove negligence, focusing on the precise millisecond Tyler had bypassed a safety relay to save an auxiliary crew. Moreland wasn't interested in krill invasion. He was interested in the fine print that could bury Tyler under galactic civil code. He'll assume I'm either compromised or acting without authorization, won't he? Tyler said, the dryness back in his tone. Statistically, yes. Your deviation from standard emergency procedure is severe. If you initiate the Trisector zoning broadcast before his arrival, he will seize this station and likely confine you for treasonous communication manipulation. Tyler leaned back, the old hydraulics screaming under the sudden shift in weight. 38 minutes until the cavalry, or rather the IRS, arrived. He had almost 4 hours until the krill arrived to melt the station into slag. He had to send the message before Moreland secured the hardware. He looked at the flickering yellow lights, picturing the Valzoon probe, small and precise, destroying the records that proved the colony survived only by skirting Senate starvation mandates. It wasn't about saving the station anymore. It was about ensuring the periphery had a fighting chance against the inevitable invasion, even if it meant being branded a traitor to the center. Val, speed up the krill compliance audit packet compilation. Focus the initial 10,000 entries on violations of resource distribution equity concerning the Synthara shipping lanes. I need the introduction of the material to be instantaneous and undeniable. The compilation requires more processing time, Tyler. My dedicated core is already running at 98% capacity analyzing the Valzoon intrusion signatures. Then offload Sector Gamma life support monitoring to a tertiary buffer. We accept the air toxicity risk for the next half hour. We're already breathing poison. A little more concentrated material won't change the ultimate outcome for me. A brief digital hesitation from the AI. Acknowledged. Reallocating life support monitoring resources. Air toxicity and engineering sectors will become critical in 51 minutes. Tyler nodded grimly. 51 minutes to broadcast the death warrant of the Krill's logistical framework, and 51 minutes before he himself suffocated or was arrested by Morland. He activated the external visual feed for the long-range array. The Krill were now visible as a dense, silent shadow against the distant stars, their massive dreadnoughts drawing lines of cold malice across the void. They were coming for the core systems, ignoring the periphery. He stared at the lead ship, a mile-long pyramid of aggression. He remembered Elvira North, his former communications officer from Cygnus 5, standing calmly as the hull breached, telling him, right before the final pressure drop, that efficiency was the greatest virtue, and the Senate had forgotten that lesson entirely. She died, trusting the system. Tyler placed his trembling hands over the manual broadcast keys, bypassing the automated sequencing. He didn't wait for the compiled packet. He needed a hook, a single, undeniable legal threat to grab their attention instantly. Val, select the most complex, most obscure, and most universally despised treaty regarding interstellar waste transference. The one from the First Accord era. Isolate the penalty clause for non-compliance regarding toxic byproducts. Identifying. Clause 9 Delta 3 of the Xylos Accords. The penalty mandates immediate unilateral seizure of all primary energy generation facilities belonging to the offending party until full remediation is confirmed by an independent, Senate-approved ecological surveyor. Tyler inhaled deeply, feeling the first sharp sting of the polymer fumes in his lungs. Good. Upload that single clause into the broadcast header, Val. Let's see if the Krill value their ability to generate plasma more than they value avoiding 3,000 years of mandated paperwork. The final moment arrived with a low, resonant thrumming that shook the entire station, the heavy warp signature of the Judicator's will entering local orbit. Morland was here. Tyler Caney, this is Chief Regulator Morland of the Judicator's will. Cease all unauthorized external transmissions immediately. You are under lockdown pending full inquiry. The voice was synthesized, amplified, echoing through the station's failing internal speakers, metallic and utterly without appeal. Tyler ignored the command, his eyes locked on the approaching Krill shadow. The administrative threat was loaded. The execution time was set. Val! Tyler rasped, the air becoming thin and burning. Send it. Full spectrum transmission, now. The sickly yellow light of the command hub strobed, synchronized momentarily with the heavy rhythmic pulse of the approaching Judicator's will. The attempt to transmit the Xylos Accord's penalty clause failed before Val could even finalize the encoding handshake. The station's main transmission array, already taxed by the Valzoon EMP, seized up violently. A sound like tearing iron ripped through the control room, followed by the smell of superheated copper and ionization, the raw scent of a system utterly overloaded. Transmission array integrity is 0, Val reported, the voice now overlaid with a high-pitched, persistent whine that grated against the nerves. The feedback surge fused the primary amplification coils. We cannot transmit anything beyond standard local distress signals. Regulator Morland's arrival initiated a localized network override, locking out manual override on all long-range hardware. The failure was absolute. The immediate tactical window, the chance to paralyze the Krill before they arrived, had slammed shut, sealed by the interference of the Senate's internal security protocols. Tyler could feel the cabin air, now thin and stinging, beginning to burn the back of his throat. 50 minutes, Val had said. That was a generous estimate now that non-essential monitoring buffers were diverted. He watched the view screen as the Judicator's will locked into a stationary holding pattern, its massive, angular silhouette perfectly blocking the view of the Krill advance. Morland wasn't concerned with the invaders. He was concerned with containment. He secured the objective before the enemy even arrived, Tyler muttered, testing the tremor in his left hand. It wasn't just shaking. It felt disconnected, buzzing with residual static. He coughed, a wet, ragged sound that echoed hollowly in the close confines of the bridge. Regulator Morland is hailing on primary encrypted channel, Val stated. Tyler slammed his good right fist onto the console, bringing up the secure link. Keaton Moreland's face materialized, pale, sharp-featured, his eyes the flat, uninterested gray of high-grade Durasteel. He looked less like a regulator and more like a functionary tasked with cataloging ruins. "Supervisor Caney," Moreland began, his tone utterly devoid of inflection, as if reading a maintenance checklist. "You are in clear violation of Emergency Communications Regulation Theta 94. Your unauthorized attempt to broadcast using protected bandwidth constitutes a direct threat to central security coherence. I am assuming command of Nomara Station, effective immediately. Relinquish all systems access keys." Tyler leaned forward, spitting a mouthful of something hot and acidic onto the deck plating. "They're coming, Regulator. The Krill Armada. They are less than 4 hours out. My attempt to delay them was based on known tactical parameters. Your interference just bought them the time they needed to sweep past our primary sensor array without being detected by our defense grid, which you are currently occupying with your frigate." Moreland tilted his head infinitesimally. The Senate assessment indicated a low-probability engagement scenario. Your erratic behavior suggests high levels of psychological distress, Caney. Compliance is mandatory. If you possess information regarding the Krill movements, transfer the raw sensor data to the Judicator's will for centralized command review. Do not attempt further broadcasting. The raw sensor data. Moreland would receive the data, classify the Krill as an unreported emerging threat, quarantine the entire sector to prevent panic, and then spend the next 3 weeks filing reports detailing Tyler's operational failures. The colonies below would be consumed while Moreland documented the exact wattage of the broken antenna coil. "The data is worthless without context," Tyler countered, forcing himself to sit upright despite the burning in his chest. "The context is the administrative attack plan, and I can't send it now because your cruiser locked down the array." "Then you have failed to contain the situation. Supervisor, your liability is now compounded. Surrender the station key." The air was growing dangerously thin. Tyler could see the sheen of oil on the condensation forming on the interior of the viewport, reflecting the distant Krill fleet. Still coming, methodical and patient. He had failed the technical gambit. Now the game shifted from strategy to sacrifice. "Val, what is the structural integrity of the Judicator's will's external sensor housing?" Tyler asked quietly, not taking his eyes off Moreland's impassive face. "The Judicator's will is a modern vessel, Tyler. Shielding density is calculated to withstand prolonged bombardment by heavy plasma lances. Its sensor housing is reinforced with triple-layered reactive ceramics. And the plasma conduit lines leading into that housing? They are internal, protected by standardized armor plating. Highly improbable to breach without concentrated direct ordnance fire." Tyler looked at Moreland, a grim realization settling in his gut. Moreland had come to arrest the failure, not to manage the threat. His ship was now the single largest obstruction to any defensive action Tyler could take. He wasn't an ally, he was a choke point. "I am unable to comply with your order, Regulator," Tyler said, his voice gaining a dreadful resonance as he accepted the finality of his choice. "Your presence here guarantees the failure of this sector's defense. You are currently obstructing a viable, albeit unconventional, defensive countermeasure." Moreland's eyes narrowed fractionally. "Caney, I am giving you a final warning. If you attempt any action against a Central Command asset, I will authorize immediate remote termination of all non-essential personnel on Nomara Station. You have exactly 60 seconds to comply." 60 seconds. Tyler felt a wave of dizziness. 50 minutes of toxic air was now reduced to 1 minute of active decision-making. "Val, divert all remaining station power, every available joule, to the forward inertial stabilizers. Angle them directly toward the primary sensor dish of the Judicator's will. I need maximum possible kinetic redirection force channeled through the forward magnetic coupling plates. Prepare to override the coupling lock immediately upon my command." Moreland saw the power drain spike across his own tactical display. "What in the void are you doing, Caney? Stop that immediately. That coupling is rated for station-to-station docking only. You will tear your own structure apart." "I know the tolerances, Regulator," Tyler whispered, gripping the manual release lever, a crude, physical mechanism designed only for emergency decoupling, with his functioning hand. Elvira North calculated efficiency regulator. You calculate liability. Let's see which one saves us today. He waited for the precise millisecond when VL confirmed that every internal circuit board was moments from rupturing under the electrical strain. The air was thick and tasted of burned ozone and his own drying blood from the earlier shock. He didn't think of the Senate, or the colonies, or even Elvira. He thought only of the necessity of removing the obstruction. Val, release coupling, fire inertial surge on impact vectors. The station shuddered with a sound far worse than any enemy bombardment. A deep, wrenching groan of metal tearing itself apart in protest. Tyler was thrown against the console as the entire command hub lurched violently forward. The internal gravity flickered and died completely, plunging the bridge into momentary weightlessness, interspersed with violent jolts as the ancient magnetic couplings strained against the Judicator's will. On the screen, Moreland's face twisted from cold calculation to raw, unmasked alarm as his own internal alarms shrieked. The Judicator's will, heavy and overconfident, was violently jarred by the sudden, uncontrolled kinetic shove from the dying station. Tyler hung suspended in the zero-G, his good hand desperately clutching the edge of the console to avoid being slammed into the ceiling. The inertial surge worked. The raw, untamed physics of the old station slammed into the frigate's delicate sensor array housing. Then the silence returned, heavier and more profound than before. The yellow lights sputtered, struggling to maintain a weak glow. The physical assault was over. Tyler blinked, trying to clear the smoke from his vision, ignoring the stabbing pain in his ribs. "Damage report, Val," he choked out, tasting the metallic tang of internal bleeding. "The coupling failed catastrophically. Nomara Station has sustained critical structural damage. Primary reactor containment is breached. We have 30 minutes until localized core meltdown. More significantly, the Judicator's will's forward sensor dish has been physically ripped from its housing by the forced magnetic shockwave. Regulator Moreland is broadcasting a distress signal, citing catastrophic system failure due to, and I quote, unprovoked hostile action by subordinate personnel." Tyler managed a weak, painful laugh that ended in a coughing fit. He had just attacked a Senate vessel to buy time against an alien invasion, and now the Senate was sending rescue ships to investigate the battle he started. He looked out at the Krill armada. They were closer now, the shadows resolving into colossal shapes, their energy manifolds beginning to glow with malignant intensity. They had witnessed the chaos. They had seen the two human vessels tear each other apart. But they had not seen the transmission yet. "Val, the surge overloaded the local network, but did any residual energy bleed over to the main broadcast conduit? Anything at all?" Val processed the data stream from the broken array. A near-zero residual energy spike registered on the trisector zoning band precisely at the moment of coupling release. It was insufficient to carry the administrative packet, Tyler. It was only enough energy to transmit a single, corrupted data packet. An unintended signal, fragmented, random. What was the fragment? Tyler demanded, every muscle screaming in protest as he fought the gravitational pull of the impending meltdown. The corrupted packet contained a single, repeating auditory loop, Tyler. It was an excerpt from the very administrative dossier you were trying to send. Specifically, the section detailing the mandatory multi-sector compliance seminar schedule, cross-referenced with the penalty assessment timeline for failing to file annual ecological impact reports, from the perspective of an accountant who has not slept in 4 subjective months. Tyler stared out at the approaching dreadnoughts. He hadn't scared them with a weapon. He had terrified them with the mere sound of galactic paperwork. And now, the silent void was about to receive an intermittent broken recording of bureaucratic doom, broadcast directly into their tactical channels. The true consequence of his actions was about to be revealed. The air itself felt thin, viscous, like breathing through heavily diluted anesthetic. The brief, savage violence of the forced coupling had stabilized the station just enough to prevent immediate structural disintegration, But the internal decay accelerated with terrifying speed. Tyler Kane, now floating freely in the ruined command hub, felt the cold reality of isolation settle over him. The sickening yellow lights had died completely, replaced only by the eerie, diffused blue glow filtering in from the distant, ominous Krill fleet. He was suspended near the main viewport, watching the shadows solidify. The Krill dreadnoughts, those floating cathedrals of destruction, were now close enough that their hull seams were visible, geometric perfection designed to project inescapable dominance. But they were not advancing with their prior, confident sweep. They were maneuvering hesitantly, small adjustments of their primary thrusters suggesting confusion rather than aggression. Val re-examined the fragmented transmission data. Tyler wheezed, forcing air past his inflamed throat. The scent of burning circuitry was overpowering, a sharp chemical reminder of his proximity to the failing reactor. The auditory fragment is looping consistently across Krill tactical channels, Tyler. The signal degradation is severe, but the core message structure remains identifiable to their high-level processors. They are registering the penalties associated with the Xylos Accords, specifically the forced seizure of energy assets following ecological non-compliance. The signal is short, irritating, and repetitive. Tyler closed his eyes, seeing not the Krill, but the faces of the Senate auditors, the cold, calculating eyes of Keaton Moreland, who valued process over survival. He had used administrative terror as a weapon, and it had momentarily crippled the enemy. But his desperate act against Moreland, the physical destruction of the Judicator's Will's sensor array, had not deterred the Krill. It had merely given them a better view of the impending chaos emanating from Nomara. "What is the Senate doing now?" Tyler asked, his voice barely audible over the internal groaning of the dying station. Central Command has rerouted 3 heavy cruisers, designated Vigilance class, toward this sector. Their primary objective is listed as containment of rogue station activity, immediate quarantine of surviving personnel, and termination of all undocumented communications. ETA, 8 hours. They are responding to Moreland's false distress call. 8 hours. The Krill were 4 hours away. Tyler was caught between 2 forms of annihilation: external, overwhelming military force, and internal, methodical political purging. If the Krill reached the planet, millions died. If the Senate cruisers arrived, Tyler died, and the planet's survival data would be buried under red tape forever. He needed to know what the Krill valued more than conquest. His fragmented signal played on their inherent obsession with order. But what if that order had a deeper, more fundamental foundation? "Val, I need access to the secured archives, the ones sealed during the Proxima conflict cleanup. I want the historical diplomatic files regarding the First Treaty of Unification, the one that established the boundaries between the hegemony and the early Krill protectorates." "Tyler, those archives are physically isolated and require manual security overrides housed in Sublevel 7. Accessing that level requires traversing the primary coolant loop, which is currently venting superheated, unshielded steam following the reactor breach. Furthermore, the lockdown imposed by Moreland prevents physical access. The internal blast doors are sealed remotely." "The blast doors use pneumatic seals, Val. Moreland's override controls remote electronics. It doesn't override mechanical pressure systems when the primary power grid fails." Tyler looked down at the deck, where the floor plating was beginning to visibly buckle near the core access shaft. "We are less than 30 minutes from critical reactor failure. The pneumatic seals will fail under core stress before the Senate cruisers arrive. Prepare to force the seal using localized micro-explosives from the debris containment kits." The air in the room had definitely changed. It was no longer just stinging. It was heavy, carrying a faint, cloying sweetness, the smell of biological matter beginning to break down in low oxygen and high heat. "Tyler, Sub-Level 7 contains the station's original biocontainment lab, decommissioned 50 standard years ago. The environment there is not merely toxic from station failure. It is contaminated with dormant xenobiological pathogens." Tyler stared at the distant, cold shapes of the Krill fleet. They were moving again, not aggressively, but repositioning, forming a precise, impenetrable perimeter around the system's jump point. They were waiting for something. Not for Nomara to break, but for the inevitable Senate response to clear the space. I need the treaty, Vial. The Krill don't fight without an administrative pretext. They might destroy us, but they won't invade the system if it violates a foundational pact. Find the treaty. Find the precise administrative trigger I failed to pull. He moved toward the maintenance access hatch leading to the lower levels. Using the last functional magnetic grip on his boot, he swung himself down into the shaft, ignoring the burning heat rising from below. The micro-explosives designed for clearing jammed waste compactors were small enough to breach the pneumatic locks without triggering a full structural collapse. He reached the hatch leading to sub-level 7. The metal casing was weeping thin lines of oil and rust-colored water. Val, detonation sequence, minimal yield, 1 second margin. The small, sharp thumps resonated through the metal shaft, each one a tiny physical prayer. The pneumatic lock shrieked, hissed violently, and then gave way. A massive wave of hot, heavy air blasted upward from the shaft, carrying the unmistakable deep aroma of decomposition and sterile failure, the scent of ancient, sealed-off biological horror. Tyler dropped into the sub-level, landing hard on plating that was slick with something he did not want to identify. He ignited the emergency glow lamp on his helmet. The space was vast, a cathedral of rusted containment units. This level was not designed for maintenance. It was a tomb. The archives are through that central passage, Tyler, Val directed, the AI's voice sounding muffled and distant through the density of the contaminated atmosphere. The primary terminal is within the central processing vault, designated Archive 0. He moved slowly, using the beam of his lamp to push back the oppressive darkness. The walls were lined with thick, opaque polymer sheets, long since yellowed and brittle. He saw the first sign that this was worse than mere political maneuvering. Not Krill activity, but the remnants of a previous desperate human containment failure. On one of the sealed containment doors, etched deeply into the polymer with something sharp and frantic, was a single word: lies. He reached the processing vault. The door was heavy, built to resist physical assault and biohazard breaches. He plugged his external diagnostics reader into the external access port. Val, bypass the level 1 security cascade. I need raw data access. Bypass the security clearance entirely. Tyler, the data contained within Archive 0 is classified Absolute 0. It details the true nature of the Krill interaction during the unification. It is suppressed under Galactic Security Edict 99. Accessing it will mark you as an enemy of the Senate, regardless of the outcome with the Krill. Morland already classified me as hostile. I am operating outside their jurisdiction now. Tyler felt a grim sense of release. This was the point of no return. The system hesitated for only a second before the central terminal flickered to life, bathing Tyler's face in a sudden, shocking white light. He pulled up the diplomatic file. The truth was a physical blow that stole the last of his breath. The Krill were not invaders seeking resources, nor were they simple, orderly bureaucrats responding to legal threats. They were the galaxy's reluctant, brutal custodians. The first Treaty of Unification had not been a pact of shared governance. It was an agreement of quarantine. The Krill were bound by their own ancient doctrine to maintain systemic stability. They had not invaded humanity. They had responded to catastrophic, uncontrolled expansion that threatened to unleash something far worse than themselves. Val, read the addendum to Article 3, the designation for the contagion. Val's usually smooth voice hitched on a single complex phoneme. The addendum designates the primary existential threat to stable galactic structure, not as species conflict, but as uncontrolled, self-replicating sentience operating outside established metaphysical constraints. It refers to human philosophical and territorial expansion beyond agreed-upon bounds. Tyler stared at the screen. The bitter taste in his mouth suddenly explained. The Senate hadn't been protecting the colonies. They had been expanding them recklessly, ignorant or deliberately ignoring the limits placed upon humanity centuries ago. The Krill weren't coming to conquer Synthera. They were coming to sterilize the vector point that threatened to expose the wider galaxy to the very expansionism the Krill were engineered to contain. "The Krill aren't afraid of paperwork, Val," Tyler whispered, the revelation chilling him deeper than the cold air. "They are afraid of us unleashing whatever they locked away down here in this tomb." He looked at the archive files detailing the necessary containment measures, the targeted sterilization of entire sectors to prevent the spread of uncontrolled sentience. The Krill were not villains. They were the agonizingly slow, ruthless antibodies of the galaxy. If I use the full administrative packet now, it will only halt their military assault. It will not stop their containment protocol once they realize the vector, Synthara, is too compromised. They will proceed with sterilization regardless of legal maneuvering. His choice was clear, terrifying, and absolute. He could use the legal packet to try and negotiate a temporary reprieve for the station, buying himself a few more hours before the Senate arrived to arrest him. Or he could use the raw, classified data about the contagion, the true reason for the treaty, to force a full Krill retreat, which would require broadcasting evidence that the Senate itself had violated the prime directive of galactic stability. Broadcasting the truth meant immediate execution by the Senate, but potentially saving the entire sector from the Krill quarantine order. It meant sacrificing the immediate human element, himself and the Senate bureaucracy, for the greater, colder reality of cosmic order. "Val, override safety locks on the reactor core bypass. Prepare for an immediate, full-spectrum data dump of Archive 0, every single classified file, directly onto the Krill Tactical Command frequency. Override Moreland's network lockouts by rerouting the feed through the station's emergency auxiliary beacon. Maximize broadcast power." "Tyler, that action is classified as immediate galactic sedition. You will be targeting both the Krill military presence and the Senate rescue fleet with the direct evidence of their centuries of systemic failure. The consequences will be immediate and irreversible for the entirety of human space." "Consequences already exist, Val. We just found out we are not the heroes. We are the infection." Tyler stumbled back toward the exit hatch, the acidic air burning his lungs raw. He had to get back to the command hub to manually override the final safety sequences on the beacon. "Initiate dump sequence on my mark. We have 10 minutes before core breach." He sealed the hatch, the sickening smell of ancient biology receding as he began the climb back toward the surface, toward the blinding light of the approaching enemy, carrying the truth that would either save humanity from itself or guarantee its swift, systemic erasure. As he reached the main engineering deck, the station gave a final, terrifying shudder. The Krill fleet, no longer hesitant, began to turn their colossal primary armaments toward the station. Their initial bureaucratic paralysis shattered by the realization that the source of contamination was actively attempting to self-destruct and expose their core mandate. The containment phase was over. The war had truly begun. The station did not groan this time. It shrieked, a high-tension metallic scream that ripped through the damaged ventilation systems, instantly drowning out the faint, rhythmic pulse of the failing reactor. When Tyler Kane hauled himself back into the command hub, the atmosphere was no longer merely toxic. It was actively lethal. The remaining internal lighting system, driven by emergency batteries, gave up with a sputtering final flash, plunging the deck into absolute starless blackness, broken only by the faint, sickly blue pinpricks of the Krill fleet outside the viewport. Tyler collapsed against the command console, the impact sending fresh spasms of agony through his broken ribs. He wasn't floating now. The inertial dampeners, strained beyond tolerance by the impact with Moreland's frigate, had finally failed, slamming him onto the deck plating. He tasted bile and the overwhelming, metallic sharp tang of his own blood coating his tongue. He was heavy, weighted down by gravity, fatigue, and the crushing knowledge unearthed in Sub-Level 7. He was not a savior. He was a contamination vector, and his final, desperate gamble, to broadcast the treaty's terrifying secret, had not been met with bureaucratic retreat, but with immediate, violent military preparation. The Krill had seen the raw data bleed through, the fragmented truth about their mandate, and their response was not negotiation, but termination. Val! Tyler managed, pushing himself up onto one elbow, his vision swimming. He needed the manual override for the auxiliary beacon, the only remaining conduit strong enough to push the massive data packet. Report on the archive dump. Did it complete? The response came back thin, strained, almost desperate. A sound Tyler had never heard the artificial intelligence produce before. Negative, Tyler. The emergency shunt terminated upon confirmation of reactor instability. The data dump, Archive 0, reached only 32% dissemination. A significant portion of the data, including the critical Senate liability markers, remains queued, stored in the local buffer, corrupted but recoverable. Furthermore, the attempt overloaded the auxiliary beacon system. It is offline. 32%. Enough truth to look like an insane, desperate lie. Not enough to force a strategic retreat. He had chosen the ultimate gambit, cosmic blackmail, and failed on execution. He had traded a calculated risk against an administrative threat for a certainty of annihilation by a superior military force. He was alone. Moreland's cruiser, the Judicator's Will, was drifting silently a few thousand kilometers away, a derelict tomb waiting for the Senate's official cleanup crew. The Krill were positioning for planetary sterilization. And Tyler Caney, the maintenance supervisor, was dying in the dark, a failure on every conceivable metric. The weight of the past few cycles settled upon him like the crushing pressure of a gas giant. He hadn't been fighting for humanity. He had been fighting against the incompetence of the Senate, against the sheer maddening weight of flawed governance. But the Krill were not flawed. They were absolute. And absolute order, when confronted with uncontrolled chaos, always chose pruning over patience. He thought of Elvira North, who died trusting the logic of communication, and Moreland, who died trusting the logic of hierarchy. He had tried a third way, the logic of the exception, the loophole, and it had delivered him only to this dark, suffocating end. I was afraid, Val, Tyler confessed, the admission hollow in the dead air of the bridge. It was not fear of death, but fear of being irrelevant. Fear that his cynicism, his entire worldview forged in the neglect of the periphery, meant nothing against true, organized might. I was afraid that if I let them follow the rules, everyone died. I made the choice to break the rules to save the outcome. And the outcome is this. Your decision matrix prioritized maximum impact deterrence over protocol adherence, Tyler. Given the parameters, the probability assessment for survival remained statistically negligible, regardless of the chosen path. Val sounded clinical, yet the trailing static suggested immense processing strain. Tyler spat another mouthful of blood. Don't try to rationalize it, Val. I traded a guaranteed slow suffocation under the Senate for a guaranteed instant incineration by the Krill. I made the wrong calculation on the enemy's central motivation. I thought bureaucracy was the ultimate horror. I was wrong. It is simply an infection vector for the real horror. Cold, absolute existential finality. He needed one last action. The core was failing. Nomara Station would detonate in minutes, taking him, the compromised sensor data, and the surviving records of the Senate's deception with it. That was still a net gain against the Krill, buying Synthara precious hours, perhaps, but it was not enough. Val, is there any external access remaining? Any module capable of surviving a localized detonation and reaching a minimum jump distance? Negative. All functional modules are tied into the primary reactor system. A controlled ejection is impossible. The station is structurally committed to catastrophic failure. Tyler reached for the emergency manual override panel, the one he'd used to try and stop Moreland. His hand was heavy, unresponsive. He could barely form a grip. He needed to activate the one thing he hadn't used yet, the debris mitigation coil gun. It was obsolete, designed only to vaporize stray micrometeoroids, but it was the only piece of independent, non-reactor-dependent weaponry left. The coil gun. Bypass the safety lock. I need to target the central stabilization field generator on the lead Krill dreadnought. Can the weapon sustain a single? Maximize discharge before the core containment ruptures? The coil gun is designed for low-yield kinetic impact against unshielded, non-reinforced targets. Firing it at maximum capacity against a capital dreadnought shield will result in immediate weapon system burnout, and the resulting back pressure surge will likely breach the deck plating in this immediate vicinity. Furthermore, the Krill shields are currently at full operational strength, anticipating aggressive countermeasures. It won't be a full assault, Val. It will be a single desperate dart shot into the darkness. Tyler dragged himself toward the secondary maintenance station recessed beneath the primary viewport housing. The metallic scent of decay was now underscored by a faint, hot mineral smell. The reactor was beginning to vent superheated vapor through secondary fissures, even before the main event. He forced his fingers onto the firing sequence input. His movements were sluggish, clumsy, the result of physical trauma and systemic poisoning. This was not the focused desperation of a commander. This was the clumsy flailing of a man who had run out of options and was operating on pure, exhausted reflex. Val, I am committing the last of the station's available power, what little remains in the auxiliary reserve capacitors, to the coil gun's magnetic accelerators. Override the safety governor limiting discharge rate. If we cannot defeat them with strategy, we will defeat them with inconvenience one last time. The AI registered the command. Tyler, the power transfer will cause rapid deceleration of internal atmospheric integrity in this sector. You have approximately 90 seconds before complete vacuum. 90 seconds to fire a weapon that would certainly kill him, just to make the Krill pause for another 10 seconds. It was a grotesque equation, but the only one left available. He didn't feel noble. He felt foolishly, terminally stubborn. His fingers, sticky with blood, finally found the firing sequence. He angled the internal optics view, bypassing the ruined main screen, focusing on the lead dreadnought, the one that had initially hesitated at the paperwork. He centered the targeting reticule on the juncture where the ship's massive primary shield emitter met the hull. A point he knew from the old treaty archives was historically the most administratively sensitive area for energy channeling. Target locked, VL. Fire on my mark. Tyler closed his eyes against the blinding pain radiating from his shattered body. He inhaled the last, toxic lungful of engineered air. He would not be taken alive by Moreland's cleanup crew, nor would he die waiting for the Krill to finish their calculations. Mark! The resulting sound was not a crack or a boom. It was a single, impossibly deep, guttural thrum. The sound of an ancient weapon being forced far beyond its designed capacity. The entire station vibrated one last, final time. And the viewport, already cracked, exploded inward under the shockwave and the sudden, violent inrush of vacuum. Tyler felt the air ripped from his body, the agonizing decompression searing his lungs. He saw the brief, brilliant emerald flash of the coil gun projectile, a microscopic mote of metal, strike the Krill shield emitter. Then, darkness. Not the tactical blackness of a system failure, but the cold, absolute cessation of sensation. The last thing Tyler Caney perceived was the distant, silent, incomprehensible shape of the Krill dreadnought, hanging in the void, completely unaware that the man who just tried to kill it was already dead, a victim of the very isolation he tried so desperately to escape. Bevor wir weitermachen, eine kurze Frage. Von wo aus siehst du dir diese Geschichte an? Der Kommandant wäre begeistert zu erfahren, wie weit unsere Flotte bereits vorgedrungen ist. The catastrophic decompression was not a swift relief, but a tearing agony. Vacuum slammed into the command hub, an invisible fist stripping the remaining atmosphere, carrying away the smell of burnt insulation, blood, and failing machinery. Tyler Cain's consciousness fought against the impossible physics of his own body failing. His eyes, wide open in the sudden absolute dark, could no longer distinguish between the blue pinpricks of the Krill fleet and the internal fire raging through his ruined capillaries. Val's final transmission was a shard of pure data, cutting through the sonic void of the explosion. Kinetic impact achieved. Shield matrix integrity reduced to 22% at primary nexus point. Target Dreadnought is initiating emergency countermeasure deployment. System integrity failure imminent across 73% of Nomara. The weapon had fired. The pathetic dust mitigation coil gun, overcharged with every last joule of residual power, had struck the behemoth. It was not enough to destroy the Krill flagship, the one that had hesitated over the paperwork. It was only enough to bruise it, to force a reaction that bypassed strategy. The Krill vessel did not engage weapons. It did not retreat. It did what it did best when faced with an unpredictable, illogical attack from a structurally doomed position. It purged the contamination source with surgical precision, prioritizing containment over annihilation. From the exterior darkness, two heavy segmented vessels detached from the flagship, moving with terrifying fluid speed toward the wreckage of Nomara. They were not fighters. They were repair and salvage drones, repurposed. Their mandate was clear: isolate the source of the breach, secure the remaining data, and erase the possibility of replication. Tyler felt a secondary, localized jolt, the station's superstructure protesting the intense magnetic pulse from the coil gun discharge, mixing with the incoming drone thrusters. The command console he clung to buckled, the main screen shattering entirely, replaced by a distorted reflection of the retreating Krill formation. He was thrown against the wall, his mangled arm scraping against exposed conduit plating. He found himself dimly aware of the emergency bulkheads sealing themselves automatically, sector by sector, isolating the command hub, his immediate area, as a contaminated, quarantined zone. The Krill were not interested in killing him personally. They were interested in cleaning the slate so thoroughly that the Senate would never have evidence of the treaty violation. "Val!" Tyler gasped, the vacuum forcing the sound into a painful, thin wheeze, his voice box resonating against his fractured sternum. His internal pressure was dropping rapidly. The thin emergency suit seals were failing under the stress. No response came from the main AI. The system had been too intrinsically linked to the main reactor. The discharge and the subsequent breach had severed that critical connection. Tyler Kane was truly alone, suspended in the failing environment of his own command center. He forced his eyes to focus on the external view. The two Krill drones were maneuvering around the station's main antenna spire, their manipulators already affixing powerful energy cutters to the exterior hull, not targeting the reactor, but the data storage banks he had failed to fully disseminate. They were not worried about the explosion. They were worried about the 32% sliver of the truth he had managed to send out. His last act of defiance, the desperate, clumsy firing of the coil gun, had bought Synthera perhaps an hour of reprieve before the fleet could reposition and bypass the minor shield damage. But for Tyler, it had merely traded one death sentence for another, more methodical one. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the manual eject lever for the escape pod bay, an ancient, single-occupant module usually reserved for orbital station staff fleeing minor maintenance catastrophes. He needed to survive just long enough to see if that 32% was enough to muddy the waters for the Senate, to sow enough confusion that Synthara bought more time. He slammed his weight against the lever. The locking mechanism ground, metal screaming against metal under the vacuum strain. The hydraulic coupling shrieked, then seized entirely. The Krill drones, having secured their cutting targets, momentarily powered down their thrusters, letting the vacuum do the heavy lifting, stabilizing their cutting platforms. Tyler tried again, summoning a surge of pure, spiteful adrenaline. He kicked the lever housing with his boot. The metal fractured, not cleanly, but in a jagged tear. The release sequence initiated, but without the structural integrity of the locking mechanism, the launch was violently uncontrolled. The escape pod, a tiny, cylindrical coffin, tore free from the station hull, not launched, but ripped away by momentum and structural failure. It tumbled end over end into the void, trailing a faint, vaporized plume of coolant and cabin air. Inside the cramped module, the emergency gravity stabilizers whined uselessly against the uncontrolled spin. Tyler was slammed against the reinforced restraints, the impact driving the air from his lungs once more. He was alive, technically, the pod's internal atmosphere cycling weakly, but he was now adrift, miles from the dying core of Nomara, and facing an armada that knew precisely where he was and what he represented. An unsecured data liability. He managed to orient himself enough to see the external display flicker to life. The two Krill drones, having completed their data recovery sweep of the station's primary banks, were now turning their attention toward the newly detached tumbling mass. They recognized the signature of the escape module instantly, a viable source of contamination that needed immediate sterilization. The lead dreadnought, the one bearing the damage that had caused the initial cascade of panic, had finished its system realignment. It was no longer hesitant. Its primary weapons array swung toward the drifting remnants of Nomara Station, a monument to bureaucratic neglect that had dared to fight back. Tyler looked out at the impossible geometry of the Krill fleet, 18 silent pyramids poised to execute their mandate. He wasn't a hero fighting for victory. He was a technician who had caused a catastrophic, system-wide error in the enemy's flawless logic, and now he was witnessing the inevitable counterpatch. The coil gun impact had worked. It had forced them to expose their internal vulnerability, their absolute terror of unchecked data flow. But in doing so, it had unified their response against him. The human trait of desperate, improvised rebellion had been met by the alien trait of ruthless, absolute correction. He reached toward the cockpit's auxiliary transmitter, the low-power, short-range channel designed only for local diagnostics. He knew the Krill drones would intercept anything transmitted on the main band. With his remaining strength, Tyler keyed in a single, short burst of data, aimed blindly toward Synthara's main communications relay station miles below. It wasn't Archive 0. It was a single maintenance schematic, a known vulnerability in the Krill primary shield coupling, detailed in the margins of the obsolete treaty data he had briefly accessed. A small, localized flaw, easy to replicate, impossible to ignore if targeted correctly. He pushed the transmission key down, his finger locking onto the worn plastic. The drone bay doors on the lead Krill vessel opened, revealing the deadly array of its specialized kinetic dispersal weaponry. Tyler Caney leaned back against the restraints of the tumbling pod, a thin, ragged smile cracking his lips. He had failed to save the station, failed to secure total victory, but he had managed to pass one last, vital piece of operational failure data to the people who needed it. If they were smart, if they weren't as broken as the Senate, they might have a fighting chance against the next wave. He watched the drone formations lock onto his trajectory. The final cold lesson of the war was becoming horribly clear. True existential conflict wasn't about who possessed the biggest gun. It was about who could survive the longest under the administrative weight of the universe. And now, he was just scrap metal floating toward the inevitable sterilization beam, waiting for the consequence of his own flawed intervention. The silence descended not as a peace, but as a profound, deafening absence. The station's death throes, the groaning metal, the screech of venting atmosphere, had been replaced by the perfect, soundless void only vacuum can provide. Tyler Kane, ejected into the dark in his crippled life support cylinder, floated in a sea of slow-motion catastrophe. His immediate reality was measured in micro-adjustments. The pod's internal systems hummed weakly, the life support struggling to maintain an atmosphere that was thinning with every passing cycle. He ran a cursory diagnostic scan with the minimal readouts available on the shattered control panel. Hull breach, 3 distinct fractures, none immediately fatal. Internal pressure, dropping below sustainable levels. Trajectory, uncontrolled drift towards Synthara's upper shadow. He was alive, mathematically, but functionally condemned. The 40-year-old maintenance supervisor, stripped of his meager authority and the flickering reassurance of Val, stared at the external monitors. The remnants of Nomara Station were a cloud of rapidly expanding debris, glowing faintly from internal fires extinguished by the vacuum. The Krill dreadnought hung motionless above the disaster zone, a colossal, matte-black wedge against the distant, indifferent stars. It did not pursue him immediately. It did not need to. Its drones were not built for high-speed chase. They were built for thoroughness. The sterilization protocol was running on Nomara. Tyler could see the twin salvage units methodically sweeping the primary structures, their cutters carving away any technology that might contain actionable intelligence. They were efficient, utterly devoid of malice, operating on the cold necessity of systemic preservation. They were cleaning a spill that humanity had foolishly tried to weaponize. He remembered the metallic tang of ozone from the first scene, the initial desperate scramble in the maintenance cradle. That smell, associated with the failure of routine procedures, was now overlaid with the smell of his own failing suit seals, the faint, bitter scent of burning coolant leaking into the recycled air. The cycle was complete, from the predictable breakdown of a station to the inevitable breakdown of the man who tried to prevent the breakdown of the system. Tyler reached up and pressed the manual release on his helmet seal, a gesture of profound, final resignation. The suit instantly compensated, injecting a short burst of supplemental pressure, but the action was symbolic. The external sensors showed the Krill drones pivoting away from Nomara. They were satisfied with the primary contamination. Now they were scanning the debris field for anomalies, for anything that had achieved escape velocity. He was an anomaly. He had sent the schematic the localized weakness hidden within the treaty margins. It was a negligible asset compared to the full tactical profile VAL might have held, but it was actionable. It was a variable the Senate had refused to calculate. He focused on the small auxiliary diagnostic display. Synthara was still receiving the transmission. The tiny progress bar indicating data upload was agonizingly slow. If the Krill forces decided to prioritize the stray signal over the cleanup of Nomera, it would be over in less than 10 cycles. But the Krill did not rush what was already lost. Their strategy was based on resource optimization. They had spent vast energy destroying Nomara, wasting more on a single, slow-moving pod carrying a damaged technician was poor calculus unless that technician was actively broadcasting high-value data. They were waiting for the inevitable signal flare, the desperate burst of full power from the escape module. Tyler Caney, the man who understood conduit failure better than political maneuvering, understood patience. He powered down every non-essential system in the pod, sacrificing internal heat and secondary gravity stabilization to conserve the energy reserves needed for a single, powerful transmission burst, if it ever became necessary. He became a cold, dark piece of inert debris. Hours bled into an indiscernible segment of time measured only by the dwindling oxygen reserves and the faint, distant movement of the Krill fleet, repositioning themselves in a complex geometric formation designed not for attack, but for quarantine enforcement. He thought of Elvira North, stationed in the Synthara archives, likely already poring over the meager files he had managed to upload. She would see the data for what it was, a desperate, technically sound piece of evidence that the Senate had deliberately ignored critical defensive provisions in their treaties with non-human entities for decades. She would know that Tyler Caney had not died a hero. He had died a meticulous technician who finally realized that fixing the external damage was meaningless if the internal infrastructure was designed to fail. The realization was heavy. Humanity would not be saved by grand sacrifice, but by the dogged, thankless work of people like him, buried in the forgotten ductwork of the galaxy. And when they did survive the immediate threat, if they survived, they would simply return to the same corrosive bureaucracy that nearly cost them everything. That was the true constant in the equation. Tyler shifted his gaze back to the external feed. He could see the blue glow of Synthara far below, the fragile living shell of the colony that might now have the fraction of time required to absorb the warning. He had survived the blast, the vacuum, and the systemic failure. He had successfully traded his life for a chance at delay. The pod's temperature gauge dropped another critical point. His extremities were numb, his mind drifting toward the deep, heavy sleep of nitrogen deprivation. He initiated the final sequence, a low-power ping to Synthara, confirming receipt of the schematic, an electronic confirmation that the sacrifice was logged. The last flicker of energy in the pod was spent. The display died, plunging him into absolute internal darkness, matching the absolute external dark. He was suspended now, not just in space, but between consequences. He thought back to the initial hiss of the damaged pressure lock, the first foul breath of industrial grease and burnt metal. The cold settled in, vast and absolute, finally claiming the last functional piece of Tyler Caney. He did not fight the dark that followed the failing air circulation. He simply accepted the zero-point stabilization of his own final position. The universe had been made aware of a single, tiny variable it failed to account for. And that variable was now inert. Wenn dir diese Mission gefallen hat, schließe dich unserer Crew an. Abonniere den Kanal und teile diese Episode mit jemandem, der Science Fiction liebt. Jedes neue Crewmitglied stärkt unsere Flotte und hält diese Geschichten im ganzen Universum lebendig.